Welcome, dear reader. Pull your chair a little closer. Tonight the wind may do what it wishes, howl at the chimney, carry the smell of salt and wet stone from some distant shore. None of that concerns us. What concerns us is Cornwall, a cliff edge, a moonless October night, and a young man who stood to inherit everything by morning and was gone before the sun rose. No note, no farewell, no body washed ashore, only the sea, indifferent as always, and a household full of people who each had their own very particular reason to want that inheritance for themselves. The police called it an accident. That uncertainty summoned one particular little man from London, a man with a neat moustache, an obsession with order, and a mind that worked, as he himself said, with the little grey cells. Always the little grey cells. Hercule Poirot was here, and the cliffs of Cornwall were keeping their secrets. For now, the tide is coming in. The edge of inheritance. The train from London arrived at Penzance just past 3 in the afternoon, grey and sulking beneath a sky that could not quite decide whether to rain or simply threaten it indefinitely. Hercule Poirot stepped onto the platform with the careful deliberateness of a man who considered wet shoe leather a personal affront. He wore his overcoat buttoned to the throat, his hat set at its customary precise angle, and he carried in his left hand a small leather bag, which contained, among other things, 2 pairs of spare gloves and a tin of his preferred tisane. For he had learned long ago that Cornwall, however dramatic its scenery, could not be relied upon to produce a decent cup of anything. That is, Captain Hastings, was already on the platform waiting for him, having arrived on an earlier train at his specific instruction. Poirot did not like to arrive somewhere without someone reliable already positioned. He called it the sensible preparation. I had long since stopped arguing with it. "Hastings," he said, gripping my hand briefly, "you have the motor car. Hired one this morning. It's just outside Bonn. And the estate, Trevellick Hall, it is how far? About 11 miles. Along the coast road, mostly. It's rather beautiful, actually, in a bleak sort of way." Poirot looked at the sky with an expression of profound skepticism. "Beautiful," he repeated, as though the word required further examination. "Yes, we shall see." Trevellick Hall sat on the cliff top above the village of Porthelon, like something that had grown there rather than been built. A long, low granite house, Elizabethan at its bones, added to carelessly over the centuries, until it had become a rambling, asymmetric thing with too many chimneys and not enough warmth. The drive approached from the east, through a corridor of wind-bent hawthorn, and as we came around the final bend the sea appeared suddenly below, vast, iron-gray, and entirely unimpressed by our arrival. A manservant met us at the door. His name, we were told, was Roscia, a Cornishman born and bred, with a face like weathered cliffstone and eyes that gave away approximately nothing. "Mr. Poirot," he said, "the family is in the drawing-room, Mrs. Trevellick asked that you be shown straight through." The drawing-room of Trevellick Hall was the kind of room that had hosted 2 centuries of uncomfortable conversations. High-ceilinged, cold despite the fire furnished in the heavy Victorian manner, dark oak, faded brocade, portraits of dead Trevellicks staring down from the walls with unanimous disapproval. There were 4 people waiting for us. The first was Mrs. Edith Trevellick, the deceased patriarch's widow, though widow seemed too soft a word for her. She was perhaps 60, upright as a church pillar, dressed in black, that owed nothing to mourning and everything to habit. Her eyes were sharp and pale and moved to Poirot the moment he entered with the assessing speed of a woman who had spent a lifetime calculating the precise usefulness of everyone around her. Beside her sat Miss Rosalind Trevellick, the eldest daughter, 32, handsome in an angular way, with an expression of permanent mild grievance that suggested life had not delivered on its promises. She held a cup of tea she was not drinking. Standing near the window, slightly apart, was Mr. Gerald Trevellick, the dead man's nephew, arrived from Bristol some 3 days prior. He was 40, broad-shouldered, with the careful friendliness of a man who wants something and knows better than to say so directly. And in the armchair nearest the fire, small, almost buried in it, sat Dr. Pendrew, the family physician, a round-faced man of 65 who looked as though he had not slept properly in some days. He rose when we entered and shook Poirot's hand with both of his own, which Poirot noted. I could tell, though he said nothing. "Mr. Poirot," Mrs. Trevelyan did not rise. "Thank you for coming. I trust the journey was not too disagreeable." "It was Cornwall in October, madam. One does not expect agreeable." He settled into the offered chair with precision. "Now, you will tell me about your son." A brief silence moved through the room like a draught. Oliver Trevelyan had been 26 years old, the only son, the legal heir to Trevelyan Hall, its lands, its considerable accumulated debts, and, rather more significantly, a trust fund of some £80,000 which, under the precise terms of his grandfather's will, was to transfer entirely to Oliver upon his 27th birthday. That birthday had been yesterday. Oliver had been seen last at 20 minutes past 10 on the night before, walking toward the cliff path, alone, in the dark. Roscier had seen him from the kitchen window. Oliver had not come back for dinner. He had not come back for breakfast. He had not, as of this moment, come back at all. "The police," said Mrs. Trevelyan, with a restraint that cost her something, "have found nothing. They speak of the tides, of accidents." Her pale eyes did not waver. "I do not believe in accidents, Mr. Poirot." Poirot was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire. "No," he said at last. "Neither, madame, do I." Outside, the wind pressed against the windows of Trevelyan Hall, and somewhere far below, the sea moved against the cliffs with the slow, indifferent patience of something that has been keeping secrets for a very long time. The empty bedroom Poirot asked to see the room that evening. Not the cliffs, not the path, not the place where Oliver Trevelyan had last been seen walking into the dark. The room first, always the room. I had been with Poirot long enough to know that he believed a man's private space told you something his public face never would. The objects a person chose to keep close, the ones they chose to hide, the particular disorder or order of a life interrupted. These things spoke if you knew how to listen. Roscier led us upstairs without comment. Oliver's bedroom was on the first floor, east-facing, at the far end of a corridor that creaked with every step in a way that suggested the house was eavesdropping. The door was unlocked. The police had been through it the previous morning. Thoroughly enough to disturb things, not thoroughly enough, Poirot would later remark with some asperity, to actually notice them. The room was not large, a single bed neatly made, which struck me immediately, though I said nothing. A writing desk beneath the window, a wardrobe of dark oak, a washstand, a bookshelf running the length of one wall. There was a cold fireplace, and beside it an armchair with a book left open, face down on its arm. The curtains were still drawn from the night before. Poirot stood in the doorway for a long moment, not moving, just looking. Then he stepped inside and went directly, not to the desk, not to the wardrobe, to the bed. He stood over it, studied it, ran 2 fingers very lightly along the near edge of the coverlet. "Hastings," he said quietly, "this bed, what about it? It has been made. Properly made. Hospital corners, you understand. Very neat, very precise." He straightened. Oliver Trevelyan went out at 20 past 10 in the evening. He did not return. "And yet, someone made his bed," I said, catching it. "Or," said Poirot, turning slowly, "it was never slept in." He moved to the writing desk next. The surface was relatively clear. A blotter, an inkstand, a small framed photograph. Poirot examined the photograph for some time. It showed 2 young men, laughing somewhere outdoors. Oliver, I assume the fair-haired one, and another, darker, unknown to me. "You know who this is?" Poirot called toward the door where Roscier still stood. The manservant looked at the photograph. Something shifted briefly in his cliffstone face. "That'd be Mr. Daniel Kahn, sir. A friend of Master Oliver's. From the village, they grew up together. And where is Mr. Daniel Kahn now? Still in the village, far as I know. The Anchor, most likely. That's the public house." Poirot set the photograph down with care. "We shall visit the village tomorrow," he said to me, rather than to Roscier. The desk drawer was unlocked and contained the ordinary debris of a young man's life. Stamps, a penknife, receipts, a folded letter from a firm of solicitors in Truro dated some 6 weeks prior. Poirot unfolded this and read it twice. His expression did not change, but he folded it again very carefully and placed it in his breast pocket without comment. I knew better than to ask just then. The wardrobe was the thing that gave me pause. When Poirot opened it, we found Oliver's clothes in reasonable order. A good suit, country tweeds, shirts, a heavy overcoat. What was not there was equally interesting. No traveling bag, no valise. I looked at the floor of the wardrobe. There was a rectangular outline in the slight dust there, the ghost of a bag that had been removed. "Poirot!" "Yes," he said before I finished. So he packed. He meant to go somewhere. It would appear so. Then perhaps he simply left. Ran away from the inheritance, the family, all of it. Some men do." Poirot closed the wardrobe door gently. He was quiet for a moment, and I thought he was considering it seriously. Later, I would realize he had already moved past it, and was simply being polite about my suggestion. "Perhaps," he said. "But then why go out at 10 in the evening, in the dark, toward the cliffs? If one is leaving Hastings, one takes the road, not the cliff path." I had no answer for that. On the bookshelf, between a copy of Stevenson and a torn nautical almanac, Poirot found a second item of interest. A small notebook, leather-bound, no name on the cover. He leafed through it standing at the shelf. Most of it was unremarkable. Notes, figures, what looked like tide times. But near the back, in a different ink, slightly more hurried, was a single line: "If something happens to me, look to what was promised before Father died." Poirot read it 3 times. Then he closed the notebook and held it in both hands for a moment, very still, with the particular stillness he had when something had connected quietly inside that remarkable mind of his. "Hastings," he said. "This was written recently. The ink is newer than the rest. Within the last month, I should think. He was afraid of something. He was afraid of someone." Poirot tucked the notebook alongside the solicitor's letter. "There is a difference, mon ami. A very important difference." We found nothing else of immediate significance, though Poirot spent another 20 minutes in the room, opening drawers he had already opened, standing in corners looking at the ceiling. All the things that made perfectly rational people wonder about him, and which I had long since accepted as simply how his mind worked. He needed to be physically present in a space to understand it. He called it absorbing the atmosphere. Whatever one called it, it tended to work. As we finally turned to leave, I noticed something I had missed entirely on the way in. On the floor just inside the door, half beneath the edge of the wardrobe, as though it had fallen and been overlooked, was a small object. I picked it up. A button, dark blue, naval style with an anchor motif pressed into it. "Poirot." He looked at it. "That is not from anything in that wardrobe," he said immediately. "No. The clothes were all country things, tweeds, that sort of color, nothing naval." "So," he took it from me carefully and held it to the light from the corridor. "Someone else was in this room, someone we have not yet met. Or perhaps someone who has been very careful to appear, as though they have nothing at all to do with this business." He pocketed it. We walked back down the creaking corridor in silence, the house settling around us in the October dark. And somewhere beneath us, through the stone and the roots and the old granite bones of the cliff, the sea continued its slow, relentless work. Grey skies and grey lies. Poirot conducted his interviews the following morning. He had requested through Mrs. Trevelyan that each member of the household make themselves available between 9 o'clock and noon in the small sitting room off the main hallway. A room which, unlike the grand drawing room, had no portraits and no fire, and which therefore offered no comfortable distraction. This was not accidental. Poirot preferred his subjects slightly uncomfortable, not frightened. Frightened people lied in large, obvious ways that were almost boring to unpick. Uncomfortable people lied in small, interesting ones. I sat to one side with my notebook. Outside, the sky had settled into a flat, pewter monotony that looked as though it intended to stay for the week. Mrs. Edith Trevelyan came first, as was appropriate, and sat opposite Poirot with the rigid composure of a woman who had decided precisely what she was going to say and intended to say it and nothing else. She confirmed what we already knew. Oliver had seemed, in her words, perfectly normal in the days preceding his disappearance. He had arrived at Trevelyan Hall 4 days before his birthday, as was customary. There had been no quarrel, no unpleasantness. He had dined with the family each evening. He had gone out walking on the cliffs each afternoon, also as customary. Was he anxious about anything? Poirot asked. The inheritance, perhaps, the responsibilities that would come with it? Mrs. Trevelyan's expression suggested this was a foolish question. Oliver was perfectly capable of managing his responsibilities. I do not doubt it. But capability and anxiety are not mutually exclusive, madame. Even capable people worry. A brief pause. He was quieter than usual. This visit, I noticed it but did not remark upon it. I assumed it was the natural weight of the occasion. Did he receive any correspondence during his stay? The post came each morning. I did not make a habit of monitoring my son's letters, Mr. Poirot. Of course not. Poirot smiled pleasantly. One final thing, the evening he disappeared. You did not see him go out? No, I had retired by 9. I am an early riser. And you heard nothing in the night? No sounds from the corridor, no motor car, no voices outside. She hesitated. It was slight, barely a beat, but Poirot caught it, and I saw him catch it, though he gave no outward sign. Nothing, she said. I sleep soundly. She left. Poirot said nothing for a moment, tapping one finger very lightly on his knee. She heard something, I said. Yes, said Poirot, but we shall come back to that. Miss Rosalind Trevelyan arrived next, sat down, and immediately created the impression of a woman with considerably more to say than she intended to share. She was 32, as I have noted, angular, sharp-featured, and possessed of a quality I can only describe as compressed unhappiness. Everything about her seemed held in, pressed tight, like a letter folded too many times. She confirmed the broad facts without difficulty. What interested Poirot was the space around the facts. You and your brother, you were close, he asked. We were fond of each other, in the way of siblings who are not particularly alike. He confided in you? Sometimes. Did he confide in you during this visit? A pause. He mentioned that he had some concerns. About the estate's financial situation. Concerns of what nature? He felt that certain arrangements had been made during our father's final illness that he did not fully understand. He intended to speak to the solicitor after his birthday. Poirot leaned forward very slightly. Arrangements! You are being careful with your words, Miss Trevelyan. I would prefer, if you are willing, the uncareful ones. She looked at him steadily, then. He believed someone had borrowed against the estate without full authority. A significant sum. He didn't know who. He was going to find out. And you told no one this? I am telling you now. You did not tell the police. The police, said Rosalind Trevelyan with a precise and contained contempt, asked me whether Oliver had seemed depressed. They were looking for a reason to call it a suicide and close the file. I did not see the point of handing them something they would simply ignore. Poirot nodded slowly. You were right to wait, he said, and meant it. Mr. Gerald Trevelyan was a different proposition entirely. He came in with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being liked, shook Poirot's hand warmly, expressed his sorrow about poor Oliver, and settled into the chair with the comfortable looseness of someone who has decided there is nothing here to worry about. He was the dead patriarch's nephew, related through the male line, but outside the direct inheritance entirely. Or so the basic facts suggested. You arrived 3 days before Oliver's birthday, Poirot said. This is customary. I try to come down each year for the occasion. The family likes to be together. Oliver and I got on well. You came from Bristol, I understand, by train? Drove, actually. Arrived Sunday evening. And your relationship with Mrs. Trevelyan, it is cordial? Gerald smiled. Aunt Edith and I have what you might call a respectful understanding. She is not an easy woman, but she is a fair one. And Oliver's inheritance. the trust fund which was to pass to him upon his birthday. This does not affect you personally, of course. Being outside the direct line. Something moved behind Gerald's eyes, very brief, very controlled. He smiled again. Of course not. The estate passes as it passes. I have my own affairs in Bristol. Of course, said Poirot pleasantly. Your own affairs in Bristol, yes. Gerald left. I looked at Poirot. He's lying about something, I said. About several things, said Poirot cheerfully. But let us not rush. The liar who is comfortable is always more informative than the liar who is frightened. We shall let Gerald Trevelyan remain comfortable a little longer. Dr. Pendrew came last, and arrived looking worse than he had the previous evening. If such a thing were possible, he was a compact, round-faced man who had clearly once been jovial, the kind of country doctor who was good with nervous patients in difficult berths, who had delivered half the village and seen the other half through their dying. But whatever sleep he had managed since Oliver's disappearance appeared to have done him no good. He sat down and clasped his hands in his lap and looked at Poirot with the expression of a man waiting for something he knows is coming. You were the family physician for how long, Doctor? Poirot began. 23 years. Since before Mr. Trevelyan Sr. passed. You were present at the death of Oliver's father? I was. Heart failure. He had been unwell for some time. And during that final illness, you were in close contact with the family. You would have been aware of any significant decisions made regarding the estate? A pause. Dr. Pendrew unclasped and reclasped his hands. A doctor is not a solicitor, Mr. Poirot. I concerned myself with my patient's health, not his business affairs. It was here that Poirot made his error. He had been watching Pendrew carefully. I could see the focus in him, that quality of absolute attention. And he had clearly formed some preliminary conclusion, because he leaned forward and said, with rather more certainty than the evidence warranted, You knew about the missing money, Doctor. You knew, and you said nothing because you were protecting someone in this house. I think that person is Mrs. Trevelyan. Dr. Pendrew stared at him. Then quietly, No, Mr. Poirot, you are wrong. A beat of silence. I see, said Poirot and sat back, and something flickered across his face. Not quite embarrassment, but the particular expression of a man who has placed his foot down, expecting solid ground, and found instead something that shifted. He recovered smoothly as he always did, but I had seen it. Then perhaps you would tell me what you do know, Doctor, in your own words and your own time. Pendrew was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the gray sky pressed itself against the window. I know, he said at last, that Oliver came to see me 2 weeks ago, not here, in my surgery in the village. He came alone, and he asked me something I have been thinking about every hour since he disappeared. And what did he ask? Dr. Pendrew looked up. His eyes, I noticed, were red at the rims. Not from this morning, but from several mornings. He asked me whether his father's death had been entirely natural. The sitting room was very still. I see, said Poirot softly, and this time there was no uncertainty in it at all. I see. The tide remembers Poirot walked the cliff path that afternoon. This surprised me, I confess. He was not, by nature or by preference, a man of the outdoors. He found mud philosophically objectionable. He considered wine a personal inconvenience. On more than one occasion I had heard him describe the English countryside as something designed specifically to ruin good shoes and produce head colds. And yet here he was, buttoned into his overcoat, hat pressed firmly down against the October gust, picking his way along the coastal path above Porthelon with the careful, deliberate step of a man who has decided that something important is out here and intends to find it regardless of what the weather thinks about the matter. I walked beside him. The path ran along the cliff top perhaps 40 feet above the sea, separated from the edge by rough grass and, in places, nothing at all. Just the ground ending and the air beginning and the water far below, pale gray and restless. To the west, the village of Porthelon was just visible in the cove, a cluster of white and granite houses around a small harbour, a fishing boat or two, the squat tower of a church. What exactly are we looking for? I asked. I am not entirely sure, said Poirot, which was either honest or strategic. With Poirot, one was never quite certain. But I will know it when I find it. That is the nature of the thing, Hastings. You do not always know the question until the answer presents itself. I pulled my coat tighter and said nothing. The path curved eastward after perhaps a quarter mile, following the cliff top around a shallow headland, and it was here that the terrain changed. The grass grew rougher, the path narrower, and the cliff edge came closer. In places no more than 6 or 8 feet to the right. Below, the rocks were visible at low tide, black and jagged, the sea moving between them in slow, white-edged surges. Poirot slowed. He stopped at a point where the path widened slightly into a natural flat, a place where the cliff top leveled before the next rise, sheltered on the landward side by a low outcrop of granite. It was the kind of spot where a person might pause, stand for a moment, look out. He crouched down, which cost him something, I could tell, given the damp, and examined the ground carefully. The grass here was disturbed, not dramatically, not the obvious disturbance of a struggle, but flattened in a way that suggested more than one person had stood here recently. There were partial impressions in the softer earth near the granite, not clear enough to be called footprints, but suggestive. 2 people, Poirot said, half to himself, or perhaps 3. It is difficult to say with certainty. Oliver met someone here, someone met Oliver here, or waited for him. He straightened slowly, one hand briefly on his knee, and looked out at the sea. He did not come to the cliffs to admire the view at 10 in the evening, mon ami. He came because he had arranged to meet someone, or because someone had arranged to meet him, which is a different thing entirely. It was on the descent back toward the village, where the cliff path dropped steeply through a gorse-covered slope to join the road into Porthelon, that we encountered the witness. She was perhaps 70, stout, moving up the path toward us with the unhurried confidence of someone who had walked this way 10,000 times and intended to walk it 10,000 more. She wore a dark coat and carried a canvas bag and regarded us with the frank, appraising look particular to people who have lived their entire lives in small community and can identify a stranger at considerable distance. "You'll be the detective," she said to Poirot, without preamble. "I will," said Poirot. "And you are?" "Mrs. Nankervis, Agnes Nankervis. I live in the 3rd cottage on the harbour road. My bedroom window faces east." She set down her bag. "I was going to come up to the hall today in any case. I heard the London man had arrived. News travels quickly in Port Helen. News travels at the speed of Mrs. Rosevere at the post office," said Mrs. Nankervis with perfect seriousness. "Which is to say, immediately." She looked at Poirot directly. "I saw something the night the boy went missing. I told the police constable, and he wrote it in his little book, and I expect that's the last anyone thought about it." Poirot's entire manner shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly. He became very still, very attentive, in the way of a man whose complete and undivided concentration has been offered as a gift. "Please," he said, "tell me exactly what you saw. Take your time, Mrs. Nankervis had been unable to sleep. She suffered. She explained without any self-pity, from the kind of persistent sleeplessness that arrives in one's late 60s and simply stays. She had been at her bedroom window at approximately 11:30. She was certain of the time because she had looked at the clock not 10 minutes before, and she had seen on the cliff road below a motor car, not moving, stationary, parked without lights, on the verge of the road that ran along the base of the cliff below the path Oliver had taken. "What kind of motor car?" Poirot asked. "I couldn't say the make. I don't know motors. Dark color, black or very dark blue, I'd say. A larger car, not one of the small ones. It sat there for perhaps 20 minutes. Then it moved off, not toward the village, but eastward, away along the coast road." "You saw no one near it? No one on the road?" "Not on the road," she paused. "But there was a light on the cliff path above. A torch, I think. It moved the way a torch does when someone's walking. It showed twice and then it was gone." "One light or two?" she considered. "One. Moving." Poirot nodded slowly. "And the motor car? When it left, it went east, you say. Toward where? There's nothing much east along that road for 4 miles. Then there's the old tin mine workings, and beyond that, the road to Helston. Thank you, Mrs. Nankervis. Poirot reached out and shook her hand with genuine warmth. You have been more useful than you perhaps realize. She picked up her bag with the satisfaction of someone who had known perfectly well how useful she was. The constable, she said, asked me whether I was sure it wasn't just someone courting, as if people court in unlit motor cars at 11:30 in October on a cliff road. She sniffed. I told him I was 71, not simple. She continued up the path. Poirot watched her go with an expression that was, I thought, close to admiration. We walked into the village afterward. Poirot wanted to see the harbor road, and specifically the point from which Mrs. Nankervis's window looked east. Porthelon in October was a quieter thing than it would have been in summer. Half the houses shuttered, the tea-room closed, the harbor holding 3 boats, and a great deal of pewter-colored water. But the Anchor public house was open, as Rosquier had suggested it would be, and through its salt-filmed windows we could see the shapes of 3 or 4 men at the bar. Daniel Carne, I reminded Poirot. Yes, he looked at the pub, then at the harbor, then at the road that ran east along the base of the cliff. From here, Mrs. Nankervis's cottage was clearly visible, third along its upstairs window, facing precisely the right direction. Her account was entirely plausible. But not yet, Hastings. Not today. Why not? Because I want to know more before I speak to Daniel Carne. I want to know what Oliver told him. And to know that, I must first understand better what Oliver was afraid of. He turned and looked back up at the cliff, its dark outline against the gray sky, the pale grass at its edge. A young man climbs to the cliff top at night to meet someone. He does not come back. A car waits below without lights, leaves going east. These are facts. But why would he go? What did whoever sent for him say to make him come in the dark alone to the edge of things? He was quiet for a moment. Unless, he said more slowly, he did not go to meet someone. Unless he went to confront someone. There is a difference, you understand. A meeting implies agreement. A confrontation implies he had found something out. I thought of the notebook. If something happens to me, look to what was promised before Father died. He'd found out about the money, I said. The borrowed sum. He knew who had done it. I think so, yes. Poirot began to walk back along the harbor road, his hands clasped behind him. And I think that person knew that Oliver knew. And I think the cliff was not Oliver's choice of venue. It was theirs. He paused, looking up once more. The tide was high that night. At 11:30, the rocks below the path would have been fully covered. He said it quietly and without drama, which somehow made it worse. You think he went over? I said. Poirot did not answer immediately. A gust came in off the water, salt-sharp, cold. I think, he said at last, that someone very much wanted it to look as though he had. Whether he did, that is the question the sea has not yet answered. He turned up his collar and walked on, and I followed, and above us the cliff stood dark and patient against the failing afternoon light, keeping whatever it knew to itself. A house full of secrets. The letters were found by accident. This is the thing about old houses. They do not give up their secrets in any organized or convenient fashion. They surrender them sideways, through gaps in floorboards, behind loose bricks, inside the hollowed-out spines of books nobody has opened in 30 years. Trevelyan Hall had been keeping things for 2 centuries, and had become, in that time, extraordinarily good at it. It was Rosquier who found them, which I suspect he had not intended. He had been sent by Mrs. Trevelyan to retrieve a particular ledger from the library, the household accounts for the previous year, which the police had requested, and which nobody had apparently thought to produce until that morning. While searching the lower shelf where the ledgers were kept, he had disturbed a stack of old volumes, and from behind them, tucked flat against the back panel of the shelf, in the manner of something deliberately concealed, had slid a bundle of letters tied with brown string. He brought them to Mrs. Trevelyan. Mrs. Trevelyan, to her credit, or perhaps simply because she had run out of strategies for managing the situation, brought them to Poirot. We sat at the dining-room table, the three of us, Poirot, myself, and Mrs. Trevelyan, who sat at the far end with her hands folded and her expression entirely unreadable, while Poirot untied the string and went through the letters with the methodical care of a man who knows that the order in which information arrives matters as much as the information itself. There were 11 letters in total, all written by the same hand, a looping, slightly old-fashioned script, and all addressed to the late Mr. Henry Trevelyan. The dates ranged across a period of approximately 8 months, ending some 3 weeks before Henry Trevelyan's death. The name at the bottom of each letter was the same, Gerald. Poirot read them in silence. I watched his face and learned nothing from it, which meant he was concentrating hard. Occasionally he set one aside. Occasionally he returned to one he had already read. When he had finished, he squared them into a neat pile and placed both hands flat on top of them and looked at Mrs. Trevelyan. "You did not know these were here," he said. "It was not a question." "No," her voice was steady, "I did not. But you knew some of it. What is in them, you knew in broad terms." A long pause. Outside the dining-room window, the October afternoon was already beginning to darken, though it was barely 4 o'clock. "I suspected," said Edith Trevelyan, with the particular precision of a woman who has spent a long time being careful with words. "I did not know." The letters told a story that was, in its essential shape, depressingly familiar, though the particular details were their own. Gerald Trevelyan, nephew, Bristol businessman, had found himself some 4 years prior in considerable financial difficulty. The nature of the difficulty was not spelled out in the letters. Gerald was careful, or had been careful at the time of writing, but the amounts referenced were significant. £30,000 in the first letter, a further 15 in the third. The tone across the sequence moved from deferential to urgent to something that in the final letters became, if not threatening exactly, then pointed in a way that carried its own particular weight. Henry Trevelyan had been, it appeared, lending his nephew money against the estate. Not gifting, lending, and the terms of repayment, referenced obliquely in several letters, were tied to the inheritance. Specifically, Gerald had been promised, in writing it seemed, though that document was not among these letters, that, upon the transfer of the trust to Oliver, a portion sufficient to clear the debt would be redirected, without Oliver's knowledge, without Oliver's consent. It was, Poirot observed quietly, not technically legal. Whether it rose to something worse than that depended on precisely what documents existed and what had been signed, and by whom and in what state of health Henry Trevelyan had been when he signed them, which was, of course, exactly what Oliver had been asking Dr. Pendrew about. "Gerald came here 3 days before Oliver's birthday," I said, "not out of family feeling. He came to make sure the transfer happened." "Yes," said Poirot, "and Oliver knew, or had begun to suspect, that something was wrong with the inheritance, that there was a claim against it he hadn't been told about. He had seen enough to know something was concealed. Whether he knew the full extent," Poirot paused, "that I am not certain of. But Gerald would have known that Oliver was asking questions. If Oliver had been to see Pendrew, if he'd been going through his father's papers, Gerald would have known," Poirot agreed. "Or been told." I looked at Mrs. Trevelyan. She met my gaze without flinching, which told me nothing except that she was a woman of considerable composure. "Madame," said Poirot gently, "you said that you heard nothing on the night Oliver disappeared. I think that was not entirely true." She was quiet for a moment. "Then I heard Gerald's motor car. Late, after 11. I heard it leave, and you said nothing. I did not know what it meant, but you suspected." Another silence. Longer this time. "Gerald is not," she stopped. Began again. "I have known Gerald for 20 years, Mr. Poirot. He is not a good man in the way that Henry was a good man. But I could not think." She stopped again, and it was the first time in our acquaintance that Edith Trevelyan appeared to be genuinely at a loss. "He is still family," she said at last, very quietly. Poirot looked at her with something that was not quite sympathy but was adjacent to it. Yes, he said. Family is the oldest difficulty there is. It was here that Poirot made his second mistake, and this one was more significant than the first. He had the letters. He had Gerald's car leaving after 11. He had the money, the motive, the concealed debt. And he had, building in him with the momentum of a well-constructed argument, a certainty, which I could see forming, could watch it settle into his posture and his expression, that Gerald Trevelyan was the center of this, that Gerald had met Oliver on the cliff, that Gerald had, in some fashion, ensured that Oliver would not reach his birthday and claim the inheritance and begin asking the questions that would unravel everything. And so that evening, before dinner, Poirot went to Gerald's room and confronted him. I was not present. Poirot did not ask me to be, which in retrospect was telling. When he was certain of something, he liked an audience. When he was working something through, he preferred privacy. He would not have admitted this distinction, but it existed. What happened in that room, Gerald told me later with the controlled amusement of a man who has been accused of something he did not do and found the experience simultaneously insulting and useful. Poirot had laid out the case, the letters, the money, the car leaving after 11, the cliff. Gerald had listened to all of it. Then he had said, quite calmly, that yes, he had been on the cliff road that night. He had driven out there. He had waited, but not to meet Oliver. He had been meeting someone else entirely. Someone who could account for every minute of his time between 10:30 and midnight, and who had, in fact, been with him in that car when it drove east along the coast road. Someone whose name Gerald was deeply reluctant to provide, for reasons that had nothing to do with murder and everything to do with the fact that this person was the wife of a local magistrate, and the situation was one that neither party wished advertised. He had provided, nonetheless, a name and an address in Helston. Poirot had checked, discreetly, the following morning by telephone. The account was confirmed. He told me this at breakfast with the particular manner he adopted when he had been wrong, which was not apologetic, exactly, nor embarrassed, but rather the manner of a man filing an experience away under useful, and moving on without excessive dwelling. So Gerald is not our man, I said. Gerald is not our man for the cliff, said Poirot, spreading his toast with precision. He is still our man for the letters, the money, the illegal arrangement with his uncle. These things do not disappear because he was elsewhere that night. But if he didn't meet Oliver on the cliff, then someone else did. Poirot set down his knife. And that means I have been looking at the wrong person. The money is still the motive. I am certain of that. But the hand. He paused. The hand that reached out on that cliff-top Hastings was not Gerald's. He drank his tea. Outside, the first real rain of our stay had arrived, running down the dining-room windows in long gray lines, and the sea beyond the cliffs had disappeared entirely into the weather. Then whose? I asked. Poirot looked at the rain for a moment. I think, he said quietly, that it is time we spoke to Daniel Carn. What the solicitor knew, we did not speak to Daniel Carn first. This was Poirot's decision, made over the second cup of tea at breakfast, and explained to me in the brief, decisive manner he used when he had already thought something through completely, and was simply informing me of the conclusion. Daniel Carn was the emotional center of this, Oliver's oldest friend, the man in the photograph, the person who would know better than anyone what Oliver had been feeling in his final days. And precisely because of that, Poirot wanted everything else in order before he sat down with him. When I speak to Carn, he said, I want to know already what he is going to tell me. That way I will know what he leaves out. So instead, at 9:30 on a rain-soaked Thursday morning, we drove to Truro. The firm of Penhallow and Stride, solicitors, occupied the first floor of a narrow Georgian building on Lemon Street, above a shop selling maps and maritime charts. The outer office smelled of damp umbrellas and old paper, and the clerk who received us had the slightly startled expression of someone unaccustomed to unannounced visitors arriving in the company of a small, immaculate Belgian with an extraordinary mustache. Poirot had telephoned ahead, briefly, just long enough to ensure we would be seen, and the senior partner, Mr. Aubrey Stride, was waiting for us in his inner office when we were shown through. He was 60, spare, with the careful neutral expression of a man who had spent 4 decades knowing things he was not permitted to say. He shook hands, offered chairs, declined to offer anything else until Poirot had explained precisely what he wanted and on whose authority. Poirot placed Mrs. Trevelyan's written authorization on the desk. Stride read it, folded it, set it aside, and then, with the air of a man removing a weight he had been carrying for some time, he opened the top drawer of his desk and produced a manila folder. The Trevelyan estate, as Stride laid it out with the measured precision of a man choosing each word with care, was considerably more complicated than it appeared. The trust fund, £80,000, established by Oliver's grandfather, was straightforward enough. Upon Oliver's 27th birthday, it transferred to him unconditionally. This part everyone knew. What was less known? What had been, Stride admitted with a tightness around the eyes, kept deliberately quiet at the explicit instruction of the late Henry Trevelyan, was a secondary document. A deed of arrangement signed by Henry Trevelyan 14 months before his death, during a period when he had been— Stride paused here and chose his next word with visible care— unwell. The deed assigned in the event of Oliver dying intestate or dying before his 27th birthday, a sum of £30,000 from the trust directly to Gerald Trevelyan, in settlement of outstanding loans. Oliver knew nothing of this document? Poirot asked. He was not a party to it, no. Stride's voice was level, but something behind it was not entirely comfortable. It was executed between Mr. Henry Trevelyan and Mr. Gerald Trevelyan, with this firm acting for the former. And you considered this proper? A pause. I considered it legal, Mr. Henry Trevelyan had capacity, though reduced. He was not, at the time of signing, incapable in the legal sense. He paused again. Whether it was advisable is a separate question. A question you perhaps raised at the time? Stride looked at Poirot steadily. I raised certain concerns. They were not acted upon. My client's instructions were clear. And if Oliver had died before his birthday, Gerald would have received £30,000 automatically. Correct. And if Oliver reached his birthday, claimed the trust, and then discovered the deed, he could have challenged it. On grounds of undue influence given his father's diminished capacity at time of signing, yes, he would have had reasonable prospects of success. The rain pressed against the office window. Somewhere in the building below, a door opened and closed. "Mr. Stride," said Poirot carefully, "Oliver Trevelyan came to see you. 6 weeks ago, there was a letter in his desk, from this firm dated September." Stride did not look surprised. Yes, he came to inquire about his father's estate. In general terms, initially, he had found some correspondence. He suspected there were arrangements he had not been told about. "And you told him?" "I told him what I was able to tell him. I confirmed that a secondary document existed and that he had the right to examine it after his birthday. When the trust transferred, I advised him to engage his own solicitor before taking any action." "You did not tell him what the document contained?" "I told him its broad nature, not its precise terms." Stride's hands were flat on the desk. "Mr. Poirot, I was in a difficult position. Client confidentiality does not expire with the client's death in all circumstances. I gave Oliver what I could within those constraints. But he left this office knowing that something had been arranged against his interests, knowing that someone in that house had a financial stake in his not reaching his birthday." Stride was quiet for a moment. "I believe he left this office knowing that there was something to be concerned about. Yes." In the motor car on the way back to Porthelon, I turned the pieces over and arranged them the way Poirot had taught me. Not dramatically, not rushing to conclusions, but laying them side by side and seeing what shape they made together. Gerald had the deed. Gerald had the motive, £30,000, automatic if Oliver died before his birthday. Gerald had been there that night on the coast road within half a mile of the cliff path, but Gerald had an alibi. Confirmed, specific, corroborated. The alibi bothers me, I said. It should, said Poirot. He was looking out at the rain-blurred hedgerows sliding past the window. A genuine alibi is a fact. But a fact can be used, Hastings. A man who knows he will need an alibi arranges to have one. That is not the same as a man who happens to have one. You think Gerald arranged to be seen, out there, on the coast road with this woman, not as a matter of coincidence but deliberately. I think it is possible. I think Gerald Trevelyan is a man who thinks several steps in advance. His letters to Henry were careful. His manner in interview was careful. He does not do things without considering the consequences. But if he arranged the alibi, he must have known in advance that something was going to happen to Oliver that night. Which means he did not act alone, said Poirot. Yes, that is precisely what it means. He lapsed into silence. The windscreen wipers moved back and forth with their patient, repetitive industry, and the road wound on through the wet Cornish afternoon, and I sat with the shape of the thing assembling itself slowly in my mind, not yet complete, still missing something central, and waited for Poirot to tell me what it was. He didn't, not yet. We were on the outskirts of Porthelon, the first houses of the village appearing through the rain, when Poirot said something that seemed at first entirely unrelated to everything we had been discussing. Hastings, the button we found in Oliver's room, naval style, anchor motif. We have not yet established whose it is. No, I hadn't forgotten. I have been thinking about it. A button of that type, dark blue, that particular anchor design, it is not a gentleman's button. It is not from an overcoat or a suit jacket. He paused. It is the kind of button found on a fisherman's pea coat, a working coat. The kind of coat worn by someone who works on the water. I looked at him. Daniel Kahn, I said. His family are fishing people, Rosquier said. His family have been fishing people for 3 generations, said Poirot. Yes. He straightened in his seat as the harbor came into view below, the anchor pub sitting squat and yellow-lit against the gray afternoon. I think, Hastings, that it is time. The gathering storm the anchor smelled of salt and coal smoke and the particular damp warmth of a place that has been sheltering people from the weather for a very long time. It was just past 2 in the afternoon when we arrived, and the pub was quiet in the way of working villages in the middle of a weekday. 2 older men at the far end of the bar, a younger one stacking crates near the back. And behind the bar, a woman of 50 with efficient hands and watchful eyes who assessed us the moment we stepped through the door with the accuracy of someone who had been reading Strangers her entire life. Poirot asked for Daniel Kahn. The woman, the landlady, it turned out, looked at us for a moment. Then she called toward the back without turning her head, "Danny, someone to see you." Daniel Kahn was 30 years old, dark-haired, broad through the shoulders in the manner of men who work physically, with a face that had been weathered by the sea into something older than his age. He was wearing, I noticed immediately, a dark blue peacoat, thick wool, practical, the kind built for open water. 3 of its buttons were present and correct. The 4th, the second from the top, was missing. Its thread was still there, recently gone. Poirot saw it at the same moment I did. I know because I saw him not react, which with Poirot was always more telling than reaction. Kahn came toward us with the careful stillness of someone who had been expecting this visit and had decided in advance how he was going to conduct himself during it. He shook Poirot's hand. He shook mine. He suggested we take the corner table away from the bar, and we did. The landlady brought 3 cups of tea without being asked. "You know why we are here," Poirot said. "Not a question. I heard a detective had come from London." Kahn wrapped both hands around his cup. His hands were steady. "I heard it was about Oliver. You were his closest friend. Since we were 8 years old." Something moved briefly in his face. Not breaking, but shifting like the surface of water when something passes beneath it. He used to come down to the harbor in the summers. His father thought it was beneath him, mixing with the fishing families. Oliver thought that was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. You stayed in contact as you grew older. Letters, mostly, when he was away at school. Then he'd come back in the summers, and it was like no time had passed. That's the kind of friend he was." Carn paused. "The kind you don't get more than one of." Poirot was quiet for a moment, allowing the weight of that to settle. Then gently, "He came to see you, before he disappeared. Recently." It was not a guess. Carn recognized that it was not a guess. 3 weeks ago, he said. "He came to the harbor. We walked. And he told you what he had found out. About the deed. The money, Gerald." Carn looked at Poirot steadily. "He told me he thought someone in that house wanted him dead." The coal fire at the far wall ticked and settled. Outside, the rain had not stopped. "And what did you tell him?" Poirot asked. "I told him to go to the police." Carn's jaw tightened. He said he didn't have enough, that it was all suspicion and old letters, and nothing a constable in Porthelon was going to take seriously. He looked down at his cup. He was probably right about that. He was going to wait until his birthday, claim the trust, then challenge the deed from a position of ownership. Yes, he thought that once the money was legally his, whoever had arranged that document couldn't touch him. He'd expose it properly, through solicitors, through the courts. A pause. He thought he just had to get through one more night. Poirot placed the button on the table between them. He did it quietly, without ceremony, setting it down with 2 fingers as though it were fragile. Carn looked at it, looked at his coat, back at Poirot. "You were in his room," Poirot said. "Yes." "When?" "The evening before he disappeared, around 7. I came up to the hall by the back way, through the kitchen garden. Rosquier let me in. He's known me since I was a boy." He picked up the button, turned it in his fingers. "Oliver wanted to show me something he'd found in his father's desk. A copy of the deed, partial, handwritten, like someone had copied out the key section. He'd found it hidden inside a book. He showed you this copy?" "Yes. We talked for an hour, maybe more, about what to do. Whether to confront Gerald directly, whether to telephone the solicitor that night." He set the button down again. "I told him to wait. One more day. Just get through the birthday, get the money in his name, and then go straight to Truro with the document and a good lawyer." "And he agreed?" "He agreed." Carn's voice was careful and level, and the effort it was taking was visible to anyone paying attention. "I left around 8:30, back the way I'd come." He paused. "I was the last person to see him, before whoever else. You did not see him again that night?" "No. You did not go out later?" "To the cliff path, perhaps." He met Poirot's eyes directly. "I was at home by 9. My mother was there. She'll tell you." Poirot nodded. He had the quality, in moments like this, of absolute suspension of judgment. Not credulous, not skeptical, simply present. "I believe you," he said, and appeared to mean it. It was what Carn said next that changed the shape of everything. He said it quietly, looking at the table in the manner of a man releasing something he has been holding for too long. "There's something I didn't tell you. Something I should have said straight away, but—" He stopped. "Oliver told me that evening that he'd written a letter, sealed it, addressed it. He gave it to me to post if anything happened to him before his birthday." Poirot became very still. "You have this letter." "I have it. I didn't post it because I didn't know. I kept thinking he'd come back, that it would be all right, that there'd be some explanation." He reached inside his peacoat and produced an envelope, cream-colored, sealed, slightly worn at the edges from being carried. Addressed in Oliver's handwriting to a name neither of us had encountered before. "Miss Clara Voss, 14 Harbour Lane, Falmouth." Poirot took the envelope, held it. "You know this name, Clara Voss?" Carn looked up. And for the first time in the conversation, something in his carefully maintained composure came apart slightly at the edges. "Oliver was going to marry her," he said. "Had been for 6 months. Nobody at the hall knew. He was going to tell them after his birthday, after everything was settled and safe." The fire ticked. The rain ran down the window glass. "Mon Dieu," said Poirot, very softly. And then he was quiet for a long moment, looking at the envelope in his hands with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not quite surprise, because Poirot did not really do surprise, but something close to it. The expression of a man whose map has just been redrawn. "Hastings," he said at last, "we must go to Falmouth." The truth on the cliffs Clara Voss was not what I had expected. I am not entirely sure what I had expected. Perhaps something softer, more obviously romantic, the kind of woman one imagines at the center of a young man's secret. But Clara Voss was 24, composed, dark-eyed, and possessed of a quiet precision that reminded me unexpectedly of Poirot himself. She worked as a draftswoman for a maritime surveying firm in Falmouth. She had met Oliver 18 months ago when he had come to Falmouth on estate business and taken shelter from the rain in the same doorway she was standing in. She had, she told us, been expecting someone to come. She had not known when. She brought us into her small sitting room overlooking the harbor, made tea she did not drink, and sat across from Poirot with her hands folded and her eyes very steady, and the particular stillness of someone who has been holding themselves together through an act of continuous, exhausting will. "You know he is missing," Poirot said gently. "I know he is dead," said Clara Voss. Poirot did not contradict her. She had received a letter from Oliver 10 days before his birthday. Not the sealed letter Carn had been carrying. A different one, earlier, written in the ordinary course of things. In it, Oliver had told her everything, the deed, Gerald, the borrowed money, his plan to wait through the birthday and then dismantle it all from a position of legal safety. He had also told her one thing he had told nobody else. He knew who had taken the money from the estate. Not Gerald, or not Gerald alone. Gerald had borrowed it, yes, but someone had facilitated the borrowing. Someone with daily access to Henry Trevelyan during his final illness. Someone whose presence at the bedside during the signing of the deed had gone unremarked because it was entirely natural for them to be there. Dr. Pendrew, not as the instigator. Poirot was careful about this, and so had Oliver been in his letter. But Pendrew had been present at the signing. Pendrew had known Henry Trevelyan's true mental state at that moment, had known it was diminished beyond what the legal threshold of capacity required, and had said nothing. Had, perhaps, Oliver suspected, actively managed the situation, timed the signing for a lucid-seeming hour, ensured the right words were said, provided a kind of facilitation. In return for what, Oliver did not know. But Pendrew's surgery, Clara told us, had been significantly renovated the year after Henry Trevelyan's death. New equipment, a new motor car, small things individually, together suggestive. Oliver was going to confront Pendrew, said Clara, before his birthday. He felt that Pendrew was the weaker point, that Gerald would never admit anything, but Pendrew might if pressed correctly. Poirot nodded slowly. He had been listening with absolute attention, barely moving. And the night Oliver disappeared. "Do you know if he had spoken to Pendrew?" Clara reached to the side table and produced a letter. "This came 4 days ago, forwarded from a friend's address. Oliver had arranged it in case." She handed it to Poirot. "He wrote it the evening of his disappearance. It was posted in Porthelon, which means he was alive at least until the last collection." The letter was short. Oliver's handwriting slightly hurried. He had confronted Pendrew that afternoon, not in the evening, as we had assumed, but earlier around 5 o'clock at the doctor's surgery in the village. Pendrew had not denied everything. He had been, in Oliver's word, frightened. He had asked for time. He had asked Oliver to meet him that night on the cliff path, where they could speak privately without risk of being overheard. He had said he wanted to tell him the full truth. He had said he wanted to make it right. Oliver had agreed to go. "I know it may be foolish," he had written to Clara, "but I think he genuinely wants to unburden himself. He looked like a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. I will be careful. If you do not hear from me by Friday, tell someone everything." Poirot set the letter down. He sat quietly for a moment, his hands on his knees, looking at the middle distance in the way he did when the last piece had dropped into place, and he was simply letting the completed picture settle. "It was Pendrew," I said, "not Gerald. Pendrew arranged to meet him on the cliff." "Yes." Poirot's voice was quiet. "Gerald was the money." Gerald was the motive that existed in the background that cast the shadow over everything. But Gerald had, as it turned out, enough intelligence to keep himself at a distance from the physical reality of it. He had arranged his alibi carefully. He had let someone else carry the weight of the act itself. He paused. And Pendrew had been carrying guilt for 2 years. Oliver walked into his surgery, and that guilt became terror. A terrified man does not think clearly. You think Pendrew went there intending to. I think Pendrew went there not knowing what he intended. And that is in some ways more dangerous than certainty. We drove back to Porthelon in the early evening, the sky clearing for the first time in days, the last light going gold across the water. Poirot had telephoned ahead to Inspector Fellows of the Cornwall Constabulary, a man of reasonable intelligence who had been following the case with increasing unease and who required, it turned out, only the organized presentation of what we had found to move with some urgency. Dr. Pendrew was brought in for questioning that evening. He did not resist. He had not, I think, the energy for it any longer. The guilt had been too long carried. Oliver's disappearance had added to it a weight that had become, in the days since, simply unbearable. He sat in the constable's office in Porthelon and told Inspector Fellows everything in a voice that was entirely steady and entirely hollow, the voice of a man who has already, in some private internal court, sentenced himself. He had met Oliver on the cliff path at 10:30. They had talked, argued, for perhaps 20 minutes. Oliver had been calm, Pendrew said, almost frighteningly calm, laying out what he knew with the methodical patience of someone who has rehearsed it. Pendrew had panicked. There had been a moment, a terrible, irreversible moment at the cliff edge. Oliver had not gone over. This was the thing, the extraordinary, undoing thing that none of us had allowed ourselves to fully consider. Oliver had stepped back from the edge in time. He had looked at Pendrew, this man who had known him since childhood, who had delivered him into the world, who had just attempted to push him from a cliff. And instead of running, instead of shouting, he had said very quietly, "I think you should go home, Ambrose." And Pendrew had gone. And Oliver, shaken, perhaps in shock, perhaps simply needing the night air and the darkness and the sound of the sea to process what had just happened to him, had not gone back to the hall. He had gone to Falmouth. He had walked to the road, flagged down a passing vehicle, and by midnight he was on a late train east. He had been in Falmouth for 6 days, staying with Clara, while Trevelyan Hall filled with police and Poirot and the accumulated anxiety of people who were variously guilty, half-guilty, and innocent but frightened. He had not known. Clara confirmed this quietly, with the faintest suggestion of exasperation beneath the relief, that anyone had engaged a private detective. He had been planning to come forward after consulting a solicitor. He had been, in Clara's words, taking 3 days to stop shaking before he did anything that required clear thinking. Poirot received this information in the Trevelyan Hall drawing room the following morning, delivered by Inspector Fellows with the slightly deflated manner of a man whose missing person case has resolved itself into something considerably more complicated than a body. He received it without any visible surprise. Whether he had suspected, whether some part of that extraordinary machinery had already entertained the possibility, I cannot say with certainty. He gave nothing away. What he said after a long moment of looking at the cold fireplace was this: the sea did not take him. Good. That is the important thing. Then he asked Rosquier for a cup of tea. Oliver Trevelyan returned to Cornwall 3 days later, accompanied by Clara Voss and a solicitor from Falmouth named Trewin, who had, in Oliver's words, the pleasant quality of being simultaneously very clever and very angry on his client's behalf. Deed of arrangement was challenged within the month. Gerald Trevelyan's financial affairs were examined with the thoroughness they had long deserved. Dr. Pendrew was charged and subsequently tried, not for murder, which had not occurred, but for the attempt, and for his role in the facilitation of the fraudulent deed. He received a sentence that was not lenient. Mrs. Edith Trevelyan said nothing publicly about any of it. She continued to run the hall with the same rigid competence she had always applied to it. Whether she felt anything, relief, shame, grief, some complicated mixture of all three, she kept to herself as she kept most things, in the manner of a woman who had decided long ago that feelings were a private matter and intended to maintain that position regardless of circumstances. Rosalind Trevelyan, I heard some months later, had moved to London. Poirot and I left Porthelon on a Friday morning, the sky for once entirely clear, the sea below the cliffs a color I had not seen it achieve during our entire stay, a pale, luminous blue, almost gentle. On the platform at Penzance, waiting for the London train, Poirot stood with his hands clasped behind him and looked back in the direction of the coast with an expression I could not entirely read. "You knew," I said, "on the drive back from Falmouth, you knew Oliver was alive." He was quiet for a moment. "I suspected," he said carefully. "The letter to Clara, posted in Porthelon the evening of the disappearance. A man who is about to be killed does not post letters. A man who is frightened, who is uncertain, who wants someone he loves to know the truth in case things go wrong. That man posts letters." He paused. "And Pendrew, when we spoke to him, he was guilty, yes, deeply guilty, but not the guilt of a man who is killed. That is a different thing. I have seen both. They do not feel the same in a room. You might have said something." "I might have been wrong," said Poirot simply. "And if I had announced that I believed Oliver alive and then found otherwise, he left that unfinished. The little gray cells, Hastings, are not infallible. I have learned this. One forms the conclusion, but one waits for the evidence to confirm it before one speaks. That is not cowardice, that is method," I said. "Précisément." He almost smiled. "Method." The train arrived in a great exhalation of steam and noise, and we gathered our bags, and Poirot cast one last look at the far blue line of the Cornish coast before stepping aboard with the careful deliberateness of a man who considers wet shoe leather a personal affront. Some things, at least, do not change.